Welcome to Leith School of Theology. We are very grateful that you're joining us today for this important conversation. And to begin, I want to start with sharing why we're here. It may appear obvious, but there's two primary audiences that we brought together. One is, this week is the United Methodist Theological Field Educators Conference. So we have field educators from seminaries and theological schools across the country who are here today. And we also have a variety of Methodists and non-Methodists, folks that are interested in LGBTQ inclusivity in the United Methodist Church. And we'll be talking today about what role theological schools and seminaries play and can play in creating a more inclusive church. So as you enter discussion, I want us to remember that this is, we have the opportunity here to share and imagine together, share what we're already doing, and imagine new possibilities, both locally, regionally, and nationally in the United States. Field educators, if you're not familiar, at Leith, it's the Office of Professional Formation, so we use different language. We talk about contextual education. All of us are working in relationship to denominational leaders, to local clergy, to students and alums. So we have a variety of relationships and areas of influence that we could leverage towards LGBTQ inclusion. The other thing, more directly, is that Leith also is having this conversation for ourselves today about what we could be doing to better support LGBTQ inclusion for our students and for our alums. We are teachers, mentors, and advocates for students and alums and need to be in conversation and dialogue about how to best do that. And as we imagine dialogue together, I'd like to invite us into covenant together. We are recording only the opening statements at this podium. We will then shut off the video recording so that people feel free to speak in this room together. And we ask that you not repeat what someone says today in the discussion without asking permission. We ask that we have respectful dialogue. And we ask that if someone asks a question that you don't understand or perhaps might take offense to, that we start by asking a question about what that person means with their question. Is that agreeable? Okay, thank you. The other thing to note, Reverend Dr. Jason Whitehead will be taking unattributed general thematic notes from our conversation today so that after we leave here, because some of us in this conference are here early morning tonight, we may forget some things that were really important. So we'll have general notes. They will not be tied to your name. And we'll share those publicly as well so others have access to it, so that if that's useful to you. Finally, after this event is done, for the hour after this event, we are giving you the opportunity, if you'd like to do what some might call an exit interview or a post-event interview. If you have something you would like to say publicly on video, we have one of our colleagues at Leith, Tom Barlow, is set up in Leith Hall in room 101B, that's on the first floor. If you go straight back from the front desk to Leith Hall and then take a left. And if you'd like to say something publicly about LGBTQ inclusion, he'll record you, and we have a recording studio set up, and then we'll compile that into a public video. All right, let us begin. I'll invite Reverend Dr. Jennifer Leath to come forward and open us in prayer. Reverend Dr. Leith is our director of the Master's of Arts in Social Justice and Ethics degree program at Leith and is also the pastor of Campbell AME in Denver, Colorado. Followed after the prayer will be Reverend Dr. Tom Wolfe, president of Leith School of Theology, who will give opening remarks. Thank you.
Good morning. This morning, I invite you to join with me in a unique form of prayer. This morning, I invite you to consider a prayer from Martin Luther King Jr. and Mary McLeod Bethune adapted and interwoven with one another. But I need your participation for one line of this prayer in the middle. In the middle, you'll hear, even if Jennifer Leith had never been born. And I'm going to ask you, after that line, to say the line with your name in it. Even if had never been born. All right. I invite you to join me in prayer. Help us, O God, to see that we are just symbols of a movement for LGBTQ justice. O God, help us to see that where we stand today, we stand because others helped us to stand here, and because the forces of history projected us here. And this moment would have come in history, even if Jennifer Leith had been born. God, we call thee God because we love thee. We are glad to be called thy children and to dedicate our lives to the service that extends through willing hearts and hands to the betterment of all humankind. We send a cry of thanksgiving for people of all races, creeds, classes, genders, sexual orientations, and colors the world over, and pray that through the instrumentality of our lives, the spirit of peace, joy, and fellowship shall encircle the world. We know that this world is filled with discordant notes, but help us, God, to so unite our efforts and voices that we may all join in one harmonious symphony for peace and unity, justice and equality, of opportunity for all humankind. The tasks performed today, with forgiveness for all our errors, we dedicate, dear Lord, to thee. Grant us strength and courage, and faith and humility, sufficient for the tasks assigned to us. Amen and Ashe.
Good morning, everyone. It is, I welcome everyone to this conversation this morning and adding my voice to Jennifer's voice. This is a very special and very important conversation. And we welcome also, again, I've gotten to welcome you once already this week, but the United Methodist Theological Field Educators group gathering. You have blessed us with your presence this week, and we are grateful for the insights that you have brought to ILF, and thank you for your presence in this conversation. I'm hoping that this will be a profoundly human moment for all of us, so that we can not waste time with formalities and get right to the issue of LGBTQ inclusion in the United Methodist Church, which is a dissension within the church that continues to just distract us from what is really the critical issues of ministry and mission around justice issues in the world. Let me begin with these words. When you love the United Methodist Church and at the same time love the people who are excluded from full participation due only to their identity, you have a problem. I have a problem. We each have a problem. So I challenge all United Methodist-related theological education leaders to have a problem. And I'm talking about how the church and all its parts stands in relationship to the LGBTQ community. Several years ago, I had some business that I was sent to by another institution to London, and it had been many years since I had been to the Wesley Chapel, And I thought I had a free afternoon, so I took a taxi down City Road, and I had the taxi stop or slow down at that place where you see the cross-section of the wall of the old city of London. Now has been massed over with population. But beyond that wall, I went to Wesley Chapel, which was built beyond the wall. John is buried behind it. Many of you have, or if not all of you, have been there to see it. But across the street is Bun Hill Cemetery, and that was my real destination, where Susanna Wesley was buried. I really wanted to see Susanna's grave again and pay homage to a woman who, in a moment of history, was way ahead of her identity, and her identity was way ahead of most everyone around her. Brilliant mind, educated her children in all the classics, instilled within them a vision for humanity that was radically different than the day of its time of its age, and created the conditions for a movement called the Wesleyan movement, the Methodist movement. So I got to the cemetery, and unlike the 2 decades before when I was there, when it was wide open, there was a gate and it was locked, and there was no time listed for access. So I climbed the fence and I jumped in. And I found my way back to Susanna's grave, and I paid homage and reflection. And then I thought, I wonder who else is in here. Have you been to Bun Hill Field Cemetery? If you do go there, linger. Susanna is there, of course. John Bunyan, author of Pilgrim's Progress, who was a nonconformist. Isaac Watts, the great hymn writer and composer, who was a nonconformist. George Fox, the founder of Society of Friends, a nonconformist. Daniel Defoe, Robinson Crusoe, had a political agenda. William Blake, the poet. And there are others. Names less recognizable, but nevertheless part of the family. But what I discovered was, and it struck me in a very powerful way that day, was that our Methodist heritage was part of a cultural movement of dissenting. And we stand on the shoulders of dissenters. It's a powerful thing when you frame the reference of the tradition that you love as being one that has stood in opposition to an assessment of a society that was excluding people from the church. In the case of the Wesleys, that was their primary concern. I am struck by the power of that, and I wonder how far we have drifted as a church from that notion of our history. Because we talk sometimes about the book of discipline and whether we're faithful to it or not faithful to it, yet it was the book of common prayer and its location as being required in the church that Wesley was saying, no, let's take it also outside of the church and gather people in new contexts, in new places, and be inclusive. That's our generation's word. So let's take a moment of look. Now that we've taken a glimpse at our history, I'd like to just share a brief concept, and then I'd like to talk about how our schools, very briefly, can influence this concern of the church, within the church. And I only have a few minutes, so there's no way I'm saying it all, and that's a frustration, but that's why we're community, by the way. We fill in for each other. And I'm dependent on that. When it comes to how we're organized as a church, we have a very structural organization. And it gets manifested in the symbol of the book of discipline. And when we come together at General Conference every 4 years, we have what we call holy conferencing, but really it's about debate. And I won't critique holy conferencing, but I'm wondering if that's an exact word, of those are the words that we're helping ourselves feel more comfortable with that space, or whether they're really guiding the space. But when we think about how we make decisions as a church, it gets codified in a very concrete form of the Book of Discipline, and it seems to not invite the dialogue that we so desperately need. Bowman and Deal in their organizational theory, and we're not going to review the theory now, but it talks about, the different frames that organizations work out of: structural, human resource, political, and symbolic. And the greatest predictor of outcome is how you solve a problem by which frame you choose to look at the problem through. We continually seem to be only looking through the structural frame, which ultimately leads us to differences of opinion that we don't have any access to resolve between ourselves, or speak the truth to each other in ways that might actually influence a different outcome. So, what would happen if we moved from the spectrum of institution toward the other end of the spectrum called movement, by changing the frame of reference by which we order the church to make it more human through a human resource frame, which has plenty of structure for people who need structure, but at the same time creates a space for us to discover each other and each other's humanness, so we can cross into each other's spaces and have conversation that is much more productive. I do believe that the world is watching the church. People from outside the church are watching the church. And I absolutely believe that they see the fight and don't get the issue of why it has to be a fight. And the symbolism of it, the symbolic value of it is, and that's our outward face of the church's outward face, the symbol of the church is our outward face to the world, sees the inconsistency of our words and our actions. And that angers me, because it's not necessary if we are a church that's guided by love and relationship and seeking each other out. So we are as institutions in relationship to a denomination that's hard to be in relationship to now. This is very candid talk. But it's hard to be in relationship to because there's all kinds of ties and fingers in relationships. Some of those relationships are around funding and resourcing. At Leath, and I've made this known to the leadership of the denomination, we have created a 7-year strategy for budgeting our life and creating a sustainable plan for the future of Leath School of Theology, which is achievable, that isn't going to rely on the Ministerial Education Fund in the future. We don't know if it's going to exist or not. We will be grateful if it does. This is not rejecting the church. This is we need to make sure that we create an institution that can stand in its own full stature and be authentic to its mission. So, we are building that strategy so that we don't have to be anxious, so we aren't controlled by our unclaimed anxiety about whether we can continue to exist or not, or how others are going to see us in the future. What would happen if we continued to look at how institutions can differentiate? And I'll be very brief from this point. We are stewards of academic freedom. All of us are stewards of academic freedom. And academic freedom sometimes today is interpreted as the indulgence of a higher education institution. Well, what would happen if we, as part of our stewardship of academic freedom, help the church remember that it was the church, when it established us as organizations and built the relationships with its theological schools, that handed them the gift of academic freedom, knowing in its own wisdom moment that it was the academic freedom that was going to be our greatest and strongest gift to the church and the world. We serve the church and the world, but sometimes I think we're led to believe we serve the church and we forget the world. It's the whole world that we serve. So how can institutions get clear about their anxiety so that they can stand in their own full statures and not be triangulated by potential loss of resources, and think strategically about their anxiety about the potential loss of resources or reputation from certain quadrants? How do we help our institutions become translators of new cultural change? The world is changing all around us, and we are to be translators for the church in the world. How can we help our institutions to be an institution open to bringing prophetic clarity to the issues with which the church struggles? And what inhibits us speaking that prophetic clarity? And do we do the gut check about whether we are feeling silenced or not? How can we be known by our curriculum and the locations of our professional development? Do we teach queer theology? Are we asking people of all kinds of backgrounds and experiences to understand their location in the world and understand how when they walk into a diverse setting they are perceived, and are they aware of that perception, and are they mindful of the potential for interrupting relationships or building bridges into those new relationships? Are we clear with the church that we are doing this kind of work? To be transparent vessels that model communities of justice, inclusion, equity, that by example hold tension with the current denominational reality. Are we living what we dream for the church? And that's always work that's never done. And it's never perfect. So is there some grace as we go along that path as well? Years ago, in a parish setting, I was in the middle of a project with my parish, and I found myself tossing and turning one night. I'm being very personal here, and I hope you don't mind. I'm trying to contribute to a sense of sharing, maybe not our particular vulnerabilities, but sharing out of a spirit of vulnerability with each other. But I remember one night I was terrified about a decision my church was going to go into, having to make. It was a big world for me. And I was terrified of what would happen if the church found conflict over it, and how it was going to be a reflection on me and my leadership, and I was all torn up about it inside, and all feeling very vulnerable. And in the middle of the night, and I'm not going to overdefine this moment. I'm not going to overdefine this moment. But in the middle of the night, a voice came to me, clear as a bell, that said, called me by name and said, Tom. Knowing that I was thinking all these things about being triangulated into everybody else's world and mess, the voice said, what do you really have to be afraid of? And with that came a profound peace of mind and made me a much more effective leader in that situation of conflict. What would happen if our theological schools and all of the various leaders within them, faculty, students, staff, presidents, could come to that place in the midst of our denomination's difficulty and exclusion that is unjust? Stop worrying about what it's going to be like for them when they take a stand, and ask themselves the gut check question. Given all that we have to deal with, and all of the issue we've got to confront and the justice that still needs to be made within the church, what do you really have to worry about? What is the right way to go? I welcome this conversation. I welcome you. Thank you for being at Leith.